Hey fellow duelists, it's RagingRaidRaptor here, coming at you with a brand new edition of Can Be Better, the series where I discuss an archetype and talk about both the strengths and weaknesses, and then come up with ideas to make them better. In this episode of Can Be Better, I will be discussing the Aromage Archetype, in regards to how it could be made better without changing the core playstyle of the deck. So what do Aromages do? Well, the core mechanic of this deck is gaining life points at a very consistent basis in order to trigger the effects of the Aromage monsters, which really does make this deck stand out in terms of having its own unique playstyle. Where this deck is similar to other decks in the past is that it is a control/stun based deck that has lots of tech cards that you can run to really help facilitate this deck's playstyle. So what are the good things about them? The first positive aspect of this deck is that all the Aromage monsters are plants, meaning that you can run the Lone Fire Blossom engine to easily special summon any one of them with its effect, as well as deck thinning, since you can just Lone Fire into Lone Fire and then do that again in the same turn, since Lone Fire Blossom doesn't count as a once per turn effect. The second is that this deck can run cards like Card of Demise and Pot of Duality, as this deck does not special summon that much and runs lots of back row, as well as giving it lots of draw power and consistency. This also means that it can easily run lose one turn, as this deck does not rely on special summoning, while also being able to run other floodgates such as Rivalry of Warlords and Cactus Bouncer, since the archetype is plant only. Additionally, this deck can also run Solemn Scolding unbelievably well, since the other trap cards you run are continuous, as well as being able to regain life points needed to activate it, which is excellent since this card is almost as good as Solemn Judgment. They even have a tuner that is searchable through Humid Winds that can discard itself in order to gain life points if you have another Aromage monster in the graveyard during either player's turn, allowing you to use the effect of the Aromage monsters you have on the field if your face-up spell and trap cards were twin twisted. It can also special summon itself from the graveyard if you have another Aromage monster on the field, giving you the option to synchro summon to rev things up a bit or even go into a link monster. Humid Winds can search any Aromage monster from your deck, as I just mentioned, and can increase your life points if they are lower than your opponent's, which can be used during either player's turn, since Humid Winds is a continuous trap card. Finally, this deck doesn't actually need the extra deck in order to function, which will help it to compete slightly better when the link summoning mechanic comes out. So now that I've gone over the positive aspects, we unfortunately have to go over the negative aspects, which unfortunately this archetype does have a lot of. One of the biggest problems is that this deck really lacks any form of aggressive plays at all. Now, I'm not talking about the generic extra deck monsters you can run like Scarlight Red Dragon Archfiend or Trishula Dragon of the Ice Barrier, which this deck does technically have access to, but I'm instead referring to the cards within the archetype. The most aggressive monsters in the archetype are Bergamot and out of the Rose... The thing that looks like the fairies from Sword Art Online. That thing, okay? As both of them can increase their attack points, while monsters such as Rosemary and Kanaga are very lackluster, as Rosemary can only change monsters' battle positions, while Kanaga only sends back row into the hand, as opposed to it doing anything else, like being able to put it back in the deck, or even banishing it. Granted, Kanaga can increase your monster's attack and defense points by 500 or 1500 points, but considering that most decks use effects to get rid of problem monsters, this effect is also extremely lackluster. Also, Rosemary's second effect is incredibly lackluster, considering that not that many decks run battle traps in the current metagame, although this could change when the link summoning mechanic becomes more popular. Although Dry Winds has potential to get rid of your opponent's field, it does require you have significantly more life points than your opponent depending on what deck you're facing. The next problem is that even with triple Pot of Duality and Card of Demise, this deck is still painfully slow. Even if your build of Aromages has faster access to the extra deck by adding cards like Spore, Glow Up Bulb, or text like Debris Dragon or Junk Synchron, as the main Searcher and Destruction card are both trap cards, while every monster needs you to have more life points in order to access both of their effects. Also, the archetype has extremely lackluster boss monsters, with Bergament and Sword Art Online Fairy being the strongest monsters within the archetype. Another problem with the deck is that all the Aromage monsters have trigger effects that activate when you gain life points. Although gaining life points is a massive aspect of this deck, not having the option to use the effects later really reduces the flexibility on when you may want to use them, as you may want to save them for later during your opponent's turn, but can't because your opponent forced the activation of Garden by destroying an Aromage monster. This also gives your opponent an easy way to get around your field, which is really terrible in a slow controlled based deck. Which leads me to the final point, which is that you have to gain life points in order to use the trigger effects, which you might not always be able to do, which contributes heavily to why this deck is so slow. While the secondary effects require you to have more life points than your opponent, which can be extremely difficult considering how fast the game has gotten, even with Link Summoning. So how can we fix these problems? I feel the solution should come in the form of more monsters. Whether or not they will be more synchro monsters or more extra deck monsters is left to be unseen. However, I do think it will most likely be a synchro monster, as we did just receive a tuner and a synchro monster for the archetype. Although a Link monster would be most preferable, since most of the main deck monsters have different levels from each other. One of the ways to make the deck faster is have a monster that allows you to use the once per turn effect of every Aromage monster more than once per turn. This would easily make the deck much faster, as you would be able to search more with the effect of Humid Winds, normal summon more frequently with the effect of Jasmine, and send more back row to the hand with the effect of Kanaga, and more importantly, gain life points faster. The next solution could be to have monsters with stronger effects, because let's face it, effects like switching battle positions is extremely weak, especially since Link monsters can't actually be switched to defense mode. Maybe one of the effects could be that you can banish 2 cards on your opponent's side of the field, or an alter version of the Sword Art Online monsters effect that can prevent your opponent from using the effect of any copy of that card when it's negated, or something like that to make up for the deck's ridiculously slow pace. The next suggestion would have to be some form of protection, as none of the Aromage cards have any solid ways of protecting themselves, except for Rosemary if you are able to use its effect during your opponent's battle phase. A solution could be to have a higher level boss monster that protects all of your Aromage cards from destruction once per turn, similar to Cypher's Stardust Dragon. However, to make this card balance, your life points would have to be higher than your opponent's to use this effect. This would give the deck the ability to slow down your opponent if they were playing a deck like Blue Eyes, since they are an aggressive deck that special summons powerful monsters with destruction effects. Finally, another way to make this deck better would be to make the extra deck easier to access, if Konami wants to create more synchros for the archetype. I don't actually know how they could do this without going against the plant theme of the deck, but the only solution I can think of is to create a monster with an effect that allows you to have an additional normal summon for tuner monsters, making cards like Junk Synchron or Debris Dragon more usable in the deck. However, the text saying you can only use this effect once per turn would have to be tailored specifically for the tuner monsters and none of the Aromage monsters. This would allow Aromages faster access to both Synchro Summoning and Link Summoning, as well as providing extra speed for other Synchro heavy decks like Synchrons, if this monster ends up being a generic Synchro monster. Well, that is the end of this edition of Can Be Better. If you feel I've overlooked some ways that this deck can be made better, let me know in the comments section below. I've been RagingRaidRaptor, and I'll see you all again in the next video.